Hello and welcome to Meeting Midway, Tier 2 Prevention, hosted by the Missouri Department of Mental Health. My name is Carl Honger, and I will be your chaperone as we walk together through Tier 2 supports. What is it? How does it work? What does it use, and how do we use it? Together, we'll do a deep dive with each episode into this topic to gain greater knowledge about this subject. At the end of each episode, it's hoped that you'll have a greater understanding about Tier 2 supports and see how it relates to your daily lives. And with that, let's move on to the show. Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode. On this show, we're talking with the May Institute about their recent presentation at the 2024 APBS conference. The title of their presentation was Beyond Data Collection, Using Data to Make a Difference in IDD Settings. And its purpose was to inform listeners about several Fidelity tools currently in use across the US, and some currently under development. If you're not sure what I mean by Fidelity tool, then please listen to this episode for further information, as these tools can help organizations improve their processes. After listening to this podcast, perhaps go back and listen to our TSET podcast, where we talked with Nicole Jones for greater clarity. The flow of the show follows a brief summary of the presentation the May Institute provided, the Fidelity tools that were reviewed, tools that Massachusetts is currently developing, other resources that might be helpful for listeners to explore, and lastly, what the presenters hope for these tools in the future. For additional information, please see the show notes below. And with that, let's move on to the show. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Meeting Midway. On today's show, we have Bob, Emily, and Chelsea. Bob, Emily, and Chelsea, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. Carl, thank you for inviting us today. I'm Bob Putnam from the May Institute, and we provide technical assistance to schools and districts around PBS as well as IDD organizations. And we're also part of the National Technical Assistance Center for PBS. We've been a national partner for the last 20 years.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Salvatore. I am currently a predoctoral intern with the May Institute's PBS team. I am just wrapping up internship year with the May for a PhD in school psychology and am excited to continue as a postdoc at the May Institute. I am really focused on improving equity in PBIS and have had a lot of opportunities to do that work at the May. From working with Bob and his work with DDS, I have had really wonderful opportunities to begin focusing on work with IDD agencies. And so I'm excited to be here today.
It's lovely to be here. My name is Emily Baton. I'm the postdoctoral intern on the PBIS team at the May Institute. And Chelsea and I both came from the University of South Florida. She was in the school psych program. I was in the behavioral and community sciences PhD program, which is on the most opposite side of campus. And it was very funny that the May Institute brought us together and allowed us to meet and spend time together and really be able to continue our growth as individuals and practitioners.
Thank you for that introduction. So you three recently just did a presentation at the most recent APBS conference in Chicago, and the title of your presentation was Beyond Data Collection, Using Data to Make a Difference in IDD Settings. Can you please just describe this presentation briefly to the audience so they have a general idea of what was discussed?
The May Institute and Dr. Putnam have done presentations like this in the past, and it was a really wonderful opportunity for Chelsea and I to jump aboard on a presentation like this and to be able to expand upon it at APBS this year. The presentation focused on data tools and database decision making, which is really important within our field right now and just in general for many practitioners. The presentation also focused on creating a link to updated research and tools and having a discussion with the audience about what they're doing currently with their practices and meaningful outcomes and using that to help make decisions in their future. We showed examples of data that agencies might be collecting or could be collecting, how they could graph it, and then we spent time answering questions in order to move from that data collection phase into really making those meaningful database decision-making moments.
Okay, so in other words, your presentation was about how different organizations, states, and so on and so forth are incorporating database tools and assessments and things like that, and their fidelity and how they work. Am I in the right ball field, or is that just a little bit off?
No, you're absolutely in the right ball field. Many organizations get stuck either on that collection phase or we have all this data, now what do we do with it? And moving forward towards making that meaningful outcome connection, making that decision moment. And also you brought up fidelity, which is another point. that many organizations can get stuck going round and round with. They might see that their data is either going well for them or not going well, and then they're stuck figuring out and pulling that data apart to figure out, is it our Fidelity? Is there something else going on? So we really wanted to take that time to look at that conversation and see how you can move forward, not just from collection to making those decisions, and then finally looking at the fidelity of, are we doing what we said we're doing?
And I apologize, but there were about 3 or 4 states that you reviewed tools on. Can you just mention which states those were? I just forget off the top of my head.
Yes, we were looking at Fidelity tools from Minnesota and Missouri.
And I think the May Institute is wanting to develop the tool themselves. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. We are in the process of having a tool test driven. The tool has been developed right now. And so the May Institute and some other agencies that we've worked with are in the process of seeing how it works for them.
So let's take a step back just a little bit, because you mentioned Missouri and Minnesota. I think it was the asset for Missouri and I'm not going to say this acronym correctly, so I'm just going to say it out loud. Tiered On-Site Evaluation Tool, the TOET. So can you just tell us a little bit about these tools and how you presented them at the conference, please?
Yeah, definitely. So the asset is that first tool you mentioned, and this is one that's out of Missouri. It's developed based on the school-wide evaluation tool, or the SET, and that's a tool that's been validated for use in schools on their PBIS practices. So it's really great that it's based on that validated tool. And the asset is intended to be an annual evaluation tool of agency-wide PBIS practices. I know it contains 42 items, and some of these items involve reviewing documents like policies and procedures and PBS-related materials, and then some other items look at staff and individual interviews. So the other tool is the Tiered On-Site Evaluation Tool, or the TOET, and this one is based on that school-wide evaluation tool and the TFI. It really takes components from each of it. And again, both the SET and the TFI are validated tools, so it's wonderful that the TOET is built off of validated measures. This tool is intended to be completed at least annually with an external evaluator, and additionally, agencies can use it to internally self-assess about 2 to 3 times per year for their action planning around their PBS and person-centric practices. This tool has 29 items, and it covers areas such as team action planning, cultural responsiveness, database decision-making, and of course, universal person-centric practices and universal PBS. And this one comes out of Minnesota.
And of course, coming from Missouri, I'm a little bit more familiar with the asset, but it was really insightful and encouraging to know that Minnesota has a tool themselves and that you 3 are also working on a tool. And I know I kind of jumped ahead a little bit in terms of what the May Institute is doing in terms of developing a tool, but can you just maybe explain the tool that you guys are developing yourselves a little bit more in detail, because I want you guys to shine on what you're developing here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to. So as you mentioned, the tool is developed for Massachusetts IDD agencies, and we're calling it the MA IDD TFI. So it really is based on both the asset and the TOET. This tool has 25 items focusing on systems, practices, and data. And these items really look at the core features of PBS, and the items are in alignment with the IDD MA reg. So really the purpose of developing this tool was because we thought it was wonderful that these other states have a tool that is working for them and that aligns with their own regulations. And we thought it would be important if, given the fact that MA regulations have come out somewhat recently, to have a tool that is in line with them and we can support agencies with their fidelity of PBS implementation.
Are these tools more geared towards, because we work within a tiered approach, tier 1, 2, and 3, are these tools more geared towards tier 1, or do they cross over into tier 2? I'm just curious about that.
That's a great question. This tool is focused on tier 1. I think our goal is that in the future, we build one out for tier 2 and tier 3. But right now, at this time, we're focusing on supporting agencies with their tier 1 efforts through this PBS initiative that we're working on.
All right, perfect. Because we recently just did a podcast about the TSET, which is the progression of the asset for tier 2 and 3. So we'd be happy to share that with you three once we start getting that rolled out. We're actually doing that with a couple of providers here in Missouri. Now, and I apologize, there were a lot of tools that were really great resources that you three brought up during your presentation, but there were two additional tools that I think would be beneficial for the audience to know. One was called the Quality of Universal Implementation Checklist, and the Quality of Life Screening. I think one was developed by the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services, and one was by you three here. Can you explain these tools a little bit more and how they incorporate with the other tools?
Sure, happy to go into it. Small correction, the Quality of Life Screener was developed by the May Institute as a whole. Bob was a part of that, but Chelsea and I were not a part of its creation. But the first one that you mentioned, the Quality of Universal Implementation Checklist, or the QUIC, was developed by the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services originally in 2013. It did have a revision in August 2014, but it was designed to provide a brief snapshot of PBS, universal support interactions occurring within a IDD setting. There are 13 items, very easily scored, and it also has the instruction sheet for it. It's something that's readily available. And again, the scoring is 0 to 2, which makes it something that is easy for groups to go through and have conversations about, but ultimately get to a score that would be helpful for their institute. And then the other tool that you had mentioned is the Quality of Life Screener, which was developed by the May Institute in 2015. Dr. Putnam was a part of that team, so just want to give that highlight again. The Quality of Life Screener is designed to evaluate life skills and goals for individuals receiving support. It can be completed by the staff or the individual themselves, and having that input can be really important. And then it can be utilized yearly, or it can be utilized on an as-needed basis to evaluate that individual skills or the supports that are happening. It can also be utilized to track changes and see where supports still need to be implemented or where there's been growth, and to be able to celebrate those successes.
And I think an important point maybe to note is that, yes, these are tools, but their primary purpose is to, I kind of always think about going to your annual checkup and just like a screening, like how your health is and things of that nature. This is just more on a system-wide organizational approach to see basically how are staff doing, how are the trainings going, are we meeting, are we ensuring that staff know our policies and procedures and stuff like that. So I'm viewing all these tools as that the asset, the TOET from Minnesota, and of course the tools that you just mentioned. I mean, am I in the right ball field from that? It's really just an assessment, essentially a yearly assessment, maybe a quarterly assessment to see how we're doing.
Absolutely. It also can be used to see, again, to celebrate the successes or changes. And it's really important to consider for each agency when they're going to be utilizing it. Like you said, thinking about, is this something that's happening? What are we going to be doing with the data? And it drives those action steps forward.
The benefit, of course, is it's essentially a win-win. The organization becomes stronger because they develop a much stronger positive work culture and things of that nature, but also the individuals that they serve are getting a much higher quality of services because all the systems are in place in terms of they're alive, written, and they're sustainable and things of that nature. So I think what you three presented was very important, and I'm really hopeful that a lot of providers will explore these tools and resources to better their organization out there. So my next question is, based on all these tools and resources, I would suspect that as people travel through their life, they're going to flex between different areas. I mean, we all have our ups and downs and this and that. How is this reflected in the two previous tools mentioned?
Yeah, Chris, I just want to go back to what you mentioned around Fidelity and the asset tool that Missouri uses and the TOET Minnesota uses. That and we've had a Fidelity tool that we've used in Massachusetts, and Fidelity is linked to outcomes, both in terms of individual outcomes as well as staff outcomes. And so we really think it's important that people measure Fidelity, because a lot of times people say they do PBS, and then when you talk to them, it's a few practices, and really don't look at the systems and look at the database decision making around the meaningful outcomes. So I think it's really cool that Missouri has been using the asset for a number of years. In terms of that, has some really good outcomes with those agencies that basically use it. It's the same with Minnesota and with our tool. We see the same thing with those agencies that achieve fidelity, that basically they get better individual and staff outcomes. And it also really, as Emily pointed out, is really a tool to look at where you are, but most importantly, the action plan. So many of the tools will have the highest score, but also as agencies get more involved, they're maybe scoring at the highest, but they say, "Oh, we could do better," and actually move a little bit more forward. So, and when we look at it similar to what Missouri and Minnesota do, it's an annualized assessment in terms of where they are in implementing PBS. So it's really cool to see those states taking the leadership in terms of moving this forward across the country. And if there are other states on this webinar, we adapted our tools based on an analysis of the commonalities of the TOEIC as well as the asset, as well as our state regulations. And in terms of that, and other states may have other contextual regulations that they may need to do. But basically, all three tools have very similar commonalities in terms of looking at fidelity in IDD organizations. So to look at those last two tools, the quality of universal implementation checklist, which we call the QUIC, it's really if you want to go in and do an observation in a work setting with folks with IDD or in a residential setting, that it gives you like 16 different indicators that you can do that brief observation that's linked to the fidelity as a way for our organizations in Massachusetts to basically have a standardized way of going in and observing, or if we have what we call service coordinators, case managers in Massachusetts, they actually could go into a group home and look at what's going on in the group home. In terms of that, it's a pretty quick, give some good feedback. Our goal was really to use it as a way to acknowledge great things that staff are doing, because it's really looking at staff behavior. And then the quality of life screener, really, you can use it across an organization to look at in terms of how are they looking at what we would consider to be quality of life indicators, all the way down to the individual. And in some ways, if you look at like a cohort of individuals in terms of them working to complete this, then you are able to better define what may be your tier 1 practices or your tier 2 practices in terms of that. So it's pretty quick, but it gives you, again, a snapshot that you can use for action planning to make it more meaningful in terms of what we're doing for both the staff and the individuals. So again, it's really, you want to, as you get down to the individuals, incorporate their preferences as you use it to inform in terms of the direction you want to go to support the individuals that you have.
And I think it's really important that you mention it takes a global perspective, but then it goes down to the individual focus, which at the end of the day, that's who we're all trying to support, and we're working to make a better quality of life for. So I think that was a really important point that you made, Bob, because I think sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle of just trying to be a business. Sometimes we forget that we need to be individual focused, and in some cases person-centered, of course. I'm really happy that you brought that up there. We're kind of approaching the end of this podcast here now. Can you three give me just a little bit of what you would like to see in the future in terms of these tools being used by small organizations, state level and federal level? Can you give me just an idea of what you hope for the future on that?
Well, I'll go first. Obviously, we'd really love to see organizations implementing PBS and fidelity, because that's where you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck. We provided 3 examples that are customized to our individual states, Missouri and Minnesota and to Massachusetts. I think the other piece of it is, in terms of looking at fidelity, is really looking at what are the meaningful outcomes for the people that we serve, that from our end, that we really want to put that at the top. Like, what are your meaningful outcomes? If you look at your organization's mission statement, what what's your mission statement for what you want to do to improve the quality of life of your individuals? And part of the goal is to look at in terms of how we can kind of operationally define what those meaningful outcomes, what those values would be in terms of that. That would drive database decision making. So the question is, what are our meaningful outcomes that we want to have? Do we want to have people have better advocacy skills? People have better, in our organization, we have limited communicators. So we'd like to see people have improved communication skills, more community engagement that's meaningful in terms of that. So the question comes down to is, what are your meaningful outcomes that you want to have, and using the framework in terms of what would be on a universal basis that we'd want to do to support. And as we all know, in Tier 1, we're really looking at supporting our staff to be able to support all individuals, and then looking at in terms of what we would do with Tier 2 and Tier 3. So the research shows that, if you have improved fidelity, that you're going to get improved quality of life. And since none of us have any extra money or any extra time, the research also shows that basically it will improve the utilization of resources, increase staff retention, and reduce the amount of time that staff are engaging in responding to inappropriate behavior, and could focus more in terms of improving really their quality of life. And then I think you were talking about, like, at the state level, that it's great that our states have a standardized fidelity tool that they're using that can guide organizations in terms of how they want organizations to function. Like this is the way we do business in Missouri, or this is the way we do business in Minnesota, or this is the way we do business in Massachusetts. So it can really guide implementation. And all three of our states actually provide professional development and coaching at the state level to support agencies that are willing to move in this direction. And I also think it's really cool that Missouri has incentives for organizations. We do value-based reimbursement. Missouri is the only state that we know of that actually does that. So Missouri is putting their money where their mouth is. That is really important to provide some incentives for organizations, because this is systems change, and really without some of those incentives and then guidance from professional development and coaching, it's not easy to get there. And we all know there's a lot of challenges with staff turnover and just coming out of COVID, and that's a challenge. And lastly, at the federal level, it would be really nice if the federal government aligned their regulations with PBS and provided some incentives like Missouri has for states actually doing this. And that, I think that would support states in moving in this particular direction. So I think Missouri is leading the way. Oftentimes when you're in the state, you probably don't know that, but with the asset's been around for quite a while. You have a lot of agencies that are actually doing it. You have your value-based payments for people that actually participate. So I think that's really cool. You got a lot of the components, which I think the rest of us are trying to catch up to. And Chelsea or Emily, you want to weigh anything more?
I think just adding to what you said, Bob, some questions for individuals and organizations to consider as they're selecting tools or looking at different screeners is just to consider, does the screener you've selected match the needs or desires of your individual or individual organization? What changes do you want to make? So thinking about those long-term goals and those action steps. How often are you going to use the screener? Many times you can get excited about a new tool or something that's happening, and then you have to figure out how it's going to use, what's the training for it. So thinking about that before putting a tool in place or a screener. And then what are some of those action steps that you're going to utilize at the end? So we did this, we collected our data, but how are we going to make that change and those meaningful outcomes going forward? And does that mean additional training for our staff or conversations? And that means setting time aside to not only collect the data to utilize it or utilize the tool or the screener, but then to have those conversations on the back end and say, how are we going to make these changes? What's going to happen? And how are we making sure that we align with our state regulations?
That I would like to add is a lot of agencies that we work with and have talked to are implementing components of PBS. Bob mentioned that before. Sometimes agencies implement just pieces of it and not the full system. And so I hope to see the continued systemization of PBS because, as Bob mentioned, when PBS is implemented with Fidelity, that's when we see those really powerful outcomes. And a lot of agencies are already doing a lot of this work. So it's really just about getting that baseline data, seeing how they're doing in terms of fidelity, and identifying those action steps for their areas for growth.
And for me, it's like, which I learned from Rob Horner, is do the simplest things that will get you the biggest outcome. So we always, that's kind of our mantra when we work with agencies. What's the simplest thing you can do to get your biggest outcomes? And you succeed if you move in that direction, and then use your data to see whether that's making a difference. And then what's the next simplest thing you could do to get improvement on what your meaningful outcomes would be.
Yeah, I think all three of you brought up some really good points. Bob, what you just mentioned, the simplest thing, just do that first and then go to the next simplest thing. Sometimes the simplest thing I think organizations can do is just develop a team to actually focus on this and be consistent with it. That's kind of the very first initial step. Just have a core team and written procedures to follow everything out. And I think, as you mentioned, Chelsea, of course, there are going to be organizations out there that can do bits and pieces of PBS and this and that, and they're not going to see the full effect of fully incorporating it. I've heard of some organizations where it's just a yearly, you watch what I think a 60-minute video on it, and that's your training for the year. Of course, that's not going to be that's not really sufficient there, of course. And yeah, I think as you mentioned, Bob, Missouri is doing value-based payments, and I think it's really cool that it's really ironic that a lot of the M states in the whole U.S. are actually incorporating this. I know Maryland's doing some stuff with PBS in another way. But it seems like all the states that start with the letter M is doing something with PBS. So I think this is really ironic there, based on the information that I've seen and the research that's going out. I'm seeing majority of stuff from Minnesota, Missouri, Massachusetts, and some stuff from Maryland, of course, and things like that. So, and I'm sorry, Bob, go on.
Yeah, and the other thing, I think oftentimes people just look at PBS as practices. I think the most powerful thing is how do you build the systems to support the staff in terms of doing the practices, and then how do you use the data as a 4-letter word. Our goal is really to make it as easy as possible for people to collect some data that would be useful in terms of making decisions around improving the effectiveness and efficiency in terms of what you're doing. So the systems and the data are as important as what the practices are.
And I think that goes back to Emily's response, where you just have to be consistent and keep up with it. It's not just a one and done approach. It has to be a consistent, dedicated approach. So I'm really glad with all the answers that you three have provided here. So now, of course, my last question with most podcasts is, what resources would you like the audience to explore on their own? And because we're going to provide them in the show links below.
Well, we provided them the the quality of universal implementation checklist, and also the quality life screener, so they can explore that. These are not, you can take them and make them your own. So if you want to make some modifications to them, they seem to fit our environments in Massachusetts. I would also suggest is take a look at the Fidelity instrument that we've developed, and take a look at the asset and the TOEIC as well in terms of Fidelity instruments. We also have an Excel spreadsheet that we've used, but usually we do some training with that in terms of that helps people in terms of analyze their data in terms of making database decisions. So those are the several things that I would suggest. All of those things are public. Put the ones from Massachusetts on here, but the other ones are both public. And Emily and Chelsea, any other tools that you want to suggest?
You've covered generally all of the tools that we will be sharing. We'll also be providing access to our APBS slides. So if you want to check out anything described in there, you're more than welcome to, and especially when it comes to thinking about which questions you might be asking of the data in order to decide your next action steps.
Absolutely, Chelsea. I think that's a really great way to link to some of the questions we've discussed today, but also further questions that are in those slides or examples that might be helpful as you're trying to decide what tool or screener or what the process might look like in the future.
All right. And with that, I want to thank you three for being a member of this show. And we're probably going to touch base a year from now. You three do more research and do another presentation, because I would love to have you three back on to explore more information, maybe about the TSAT or maybe about some other cool stuff that you three will develop in terms of tier 2 and 3 and beyond. So, but again, I'm really appreciative of you three being on the show.
Thanks for having us, Carl.
Hey everyone, this concludes our show. Thank you for stopping by to learn more about Tier 2 supports and taking a deep dive into this topic with me. If you enjoyed the show, learned something, or perhaps feeling generous, please feel free to hit the like and subscribe feature to receive additional information on shows as they come out in the near future. And with that, please remember to be hopeful, bold, and adventurous in all that you do. Take care, everyone. Bye.